So in this final video for week 2, we talk about the necessary elements of every research study, or the criteria that every research study must adhere to be able to be approved by the Institutional Review Board. So first and foremost, every researcher must always conduct a risk-benefit analysis. The researcher must demonstrate that risks have been minimized, and they must identify any potential risk so that those risks can be evaluated. The Institutional Review Board determines whether the risks to the subjects are reasonable in relation to any anticipated benefits that might come from the study. If the risk of harm is more than the potential knowledge gained, the IRB will not approve the study. So it is always important that researchers evaluate, mitigate, minimize, or completely eliminate the possibility of harming a subject. So one of our ethical principles is always to do no harm. That means that risk must be minimized to staff, to students, and to any other partner in the research project. Researchers should also be aware of placing themselves in dangerous situations. That's particularly so for qualitative research. Very often, common sense precautions can alleviate, if not eliminate, many potential problems that researchers might encounter in their work. And there are several different types of harm that we should talk about. So the first is emotional and psychological harm. So it is often the case that emotional and psychological harm are not something that can be seen, right? It's almost imperceptible. You don't always know what a person is thinking or feeling, but emotional and psychological harm can be devastating for a research participant. The researcher may ask questions that recall deviant and immoral behavior that somebody may have engaged in. It can bring up traumatic events. It can trigger PTSD. It can trigger anxiety, especially when we're talking about the kinds of research that is conducted in the social sciences, right? My line of research, I have to be very, very careful of the emotional and psychological harm that can come from the questions that I ask, because I'm dealing with a very intimate subject matter. So the potential for emotional and psychological harm needs to be very seriously considered when designing a study. Second, there's physical harm. The potential for physical harm can often be difficult to measure. Seemingly innocuous research investigations to one person could actually place another person living under different circumstances at great risk of harm. So one example might be people who are experiencing domestic violence who participate in a research study could cause harm to them if their significant other finds out that they are participating in that study. Another kind of harm is financial harm. A participant's employment may be put at risk. The possibility of abandonment by a family member or an individual who is the subject's primary means of economic support. If you were conducting a study on employee theft and an employer learned from that study that an employee stole and they were therefore fired, that would cause financial harm. So again, these are necessary considerations that must be taken into account. Another type of harm is legal harm. Is it possible that the disclosure of information regarding the participant can expose that person to legal action? Has the participant been involved in illegal activities that, absent participation in the study, might not have otherwise been uncovered? Take, for example, the employee who was participating in a research study on theft. That individual might lose their employment, but is it possible that legal ramifications exist if the identity of that person became known? In my line of research, when I am asking people about whether or not they've committed a rape or a sexual assault, if that information got out in any way, could that cause somebody to be charged with an offense? Could the research participant be subpoenaed as a witness in another case based on information that is revealed? All right, so not only are we thinking about the design of our research, we also have to think about how the questions that we ask can bring serious harm to people. And that is why we seek informed consent. So people who participate in research studies should provide their knowing and willing consent to do so. Most university institutional review boards now require a signed written consent, although there are some circumstances where you can work around that when you are trying to ensure anonymity and confidentiality, which we will talk about on our next slide. So informed consent means that the research subject has knowledge of the study and gives permission to be researched. After this video, you will see on Canvas an example of an informed consent document from a previous study that I worked on. So the last thing we should talk about on this slide is coercion. It is never okay to coerce somebody into a research study. And we have to always be thinking about the vulnerability of the person or the people that we are looking to study. So the poor, people who are living in homelessness, people who are sick, elderly, people who are incarcerated, and children, and students, historically minority groups. We have to be very, very careful when we seek participation from these vulnerable groups of people. If we are dealing with children, parental consent is needed because somebody under the age of 18 cannot consent to be in a research study. Participants must be able to choose freely, voluntarily, willingly, without duress, and without being subjected to threats or the promise of too great a reward. So all of this has to be considered and dealt with before a study can ever begin. The last thing I want to talk about is anonymity and confidentiality. These are two concepts that are closely related but have some important differences. So anonymity is when no one, including the researcher, can identify any specific research study participant. And this can be accomplished in surveys where the research participants don't write their names on the survey in any way. But there are studies where researchers need to be able to track the same person over an extended period of time. And so the researcher needs to be able to locate these research participants. In many cases in the social sciences, researchers must know who the subject is and how to contact them for follow-up. But confidentiality could work. So confidentiality promises research participants to keep their identity a secret and to ensure that it remains a secret. And this is how researchers attain confidentiality. In qualitative research, anonymity is not feasible, but confidentiality most certainly is. So oftentimes research participants in qualitative studies will use a pseudonym or will be identified in research by just an initial, but the researcher creates safeguards. So one way to do this, the researcher agrees to keep all study materials in a locked filing cabinet behind a locked door on a university campus. All data that has been collected has been de-identified, meaning that the data itself is kept separate from any identifying information about the subjects, and it's kept on a password-protected hard drive. So there are ways to go about maintaining confidentiality when anonymity is not possible. Another thing that you can do is create unique personal identifiers. So a specific number that goes with each individual. Finally, I want to talk about whether or not deception is acceptable in a research study and how we go about providing rewards to people who participate in our studies. So research subjects must know the nature, purpose, and intent of a study. It is not okay to deceive people, yet providing too much information or too much detail can jeopardize the integrity of the research. So researchers often question whether letting a subject know that he or she is being studied and for what purposes, whether or not that changes the subject's behavior or response. So too many details could bias somebody's response and jeopardize the reliability and credibility of the study. It could also put the researcher in danger. So some deception is acceptable in a study, and we will talk more about that when we meet in person. Ethical standards for research do allow for participants to be compensated for their time for a study, but within reasonable limits. So compensation is not uncommon, but the amount and the schedule of payment has to be evaluated. So it's perfectly acceptable to reimburse study participants for work and travel. Like if they had to travel to come to be part of your research study, it is okay to pay them for that. And it's also okay to pay compensation for recruitment into the study. The researcher has to demonstrate to the IRB the effective payment upon the subject is not coercive or out of balance. And the IRB must be made aware of the terms of payment, and approval must be obtained prior to the start of the study. So in research that I've done on college campuses related to like sexual assault services on campus, when we did focus groups, we ordered pizza for all of the participants and offered like a $10 Starbucks card or something like that. So that's perfectly acceptable to do. But as you start paying larger sums of money for people to participate in a study, that becomes coercive and is not ethical to do. So some final notes on ethics. As we've talked about in the last two videos, the IRB process can be constraining. It can be very frustrating at times to have to put your work through a review process with other academics who may not know your field very well, but they are serving their purpose well. Recent social science studies where there's evidence that someone was harmed is rare, and that's because we have effective IRB boards in place. But the reality is that if you look over our history, you find that was not always the case. Prior to the advancement of institutional review boards, we did see people who were harmed quite often. It's important to recognize the reality that IRB boards are constraining to the advancement of science. There are studies that we cannot do because of the potential risk to study participants. It's important that we are honest about that and that we recognize that. But so what we do is we plan in advance and we try to anticipate potential ethical problems that might arise and potential harms that might arise. And when and if an ethical issue arises, we deal with them quickly, openly, transparently, and we document everything. So now you have a bit of a better understanding of the importance of ethics when it comes to research of any kind. And next week, we will begin talking about how we actually plan out a research study.